From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
We're finally here, the day of days at the White House. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As President Trump prepares to take the wraps off the tariffs at last, whether they be reciprocal across the board, autos, sectoral, or otherwise, we're going to find out, presumably, at 4 o'clock in the Rose Garden. Bloomberg White House reporter Josh Wingrove will be with us in just a moment to review at least what we know now in a day of fluidity here inside the Beltway. We'll hear insights on the tariffs from former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers in conversation with Bloomberg's David Weston. And we'll have analysis from our signature panel. Jeanette Shanzano, our Democratic analyst, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, with us here on what's going to be a long day, prepared for anything, with our eyes, of course, on the markets. And that's where we start right now with Wall Street and Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Mathieu. Indeed, very busy day. And yes, we got you covered here at Bloomberg. That's what we do. That's what we do best. Right now, we got a developing story breaking. Any other day, this would be our top story. But Amazon has put in a last-minute bid to acquire all of TikTok. Again, developing story headline right now on the Bloomberg Professional Service. That, according to the New York Times. But that headline bears repeating. Amazon putting in a last-minute bid to acquire all of TikTok, again, according to reporting by the New York Times. And Amazon shares, they are gaining now, up by just about 1.2%. Our Bloomberg reporters certainly working this story. Will have more details as they become available. Stocks higher, overcoming earlier losses. Tariff Wednesday, the countdown is on. Special coverage coming up, 4 o'clock Wall Street time when this happens at the Rose Garden. S&P right now up 11, gain there of 0.2%. The Dow up 60 right now, up by about 0.1%. NASDAQ up 70, up by 0.4%. The 10-year this Wednesday, 4.18%. The 2-year, 3.89%. Gold up $15 the ounce, 31.28. That is a gain of 0.5%. Could see a record, another record today for the precious metal. West Texas Intermediate crude, 71.48 a barrel, up 0.4%. And Bitcoin almost back at 87,000, 86,750 right now, up by 1.8%. So today's focus very much on the White House and tariffs. Jason Furman is an economics professor at Harvard, also former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration. And on surveillance this morning, he told us the tariff battle runs the risk of disrupting existing alliances.
The only way we can confront China is by doing it together with allies. And if we alienate our allies, there's a lot more countries that trade more with China than with the United States. We're just going to push that further and help realign global geopolitics away from the U.S. alliance and towards a Chinese entente.
And another major story we're keeping an eye on. President Trump has told his inner circle that Elon Musk will be stepping back from his advisory role in coming weeks. This according to Politico, citing 3 people close to the president. All of this comes as Tesla's vehicle sales fell 13% in the first quarter. Tesla shares, they're gaining today, part of a broader tech rally. Right now we got Tesla shares up by 3.9%. So a lot of moving parts to this market. Again, repeating that TikTok headline, we've got Amazon putting in a last-minute bid to acquire all of TikTok. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Mathieu.
Wow, Charlie Pellet. I've never heard them have to restart Charlie Pellet's music before. Thank you very much.
A lot going on, Joe. You know how it is.
Amazon. Yeah, we can't even fit it in. This is going to be a day like this. Buckle up, hang on, fasten the chin strap, right?
And very briefly, let's put in a shameless plug. You're working double duty again today.
Well, yeah, I mean, that we're here for the duration, Charlie. I know you're going to be too. We'll have an extended edition of Balance of Power on the other side of the day. We're just getting started here at high noon, though. Welcome to Liberation Day, as they're calling it at the White House. I'm sure they're gussying up the Rose Garden as we speak. Liberation Day, or as Doug Ford calls it, Termination Day. We're still kind of in the dark here. The markets still don't really know what's coming. Even smart White House reporters like Josh Wingrove are asking, what is the president going to say today at 4 o'clock, assuming he starts on time? It's going to be in the Rose Garden on a pretty nice spring day in Washington as the administration attempts to upend the economic world order, or so we're told. Josh, it's great to see you.
Thank you. Here.
Do they have this all baked? I mean, you have a major announcement, a major event like this. You've covered the White House long enough to know this is a big package they put together, a lot of moving parts, but we're told this is still fluid somehow.
Yeah, I mean, that is not unusual for President Trump.
Okay.
He likes to chew on things right until the very end of it, but the White House has gone kind of silent the last 48 hours, and I think that is notable. But in the past, they've been sort of trying to drop hints about where this is going. Right now, we don't really have them. Our reporting is that as of late last night, there were 4 options on the table, all of which would apply some measure of tariffs to a group of countries abroad and go from there. One, probably the most maximalist, was the 20% global tariff on everything, on everyone, all countries. Easy to enact, pretty simple.
Yeah.
Obviously, fairly significant numbers. Market reaction to that, you think, would be pretty strong on the negative side. Then there's more targeted options, including just a very directly more targeted version of that. There's a sort of a la carte option, country by country, a different number for everyone else. Pick your own adventure. Right, reciprocal. And then a tiered option where countries would be kind of lumped into maybe like a 10 or 20, that kind of thing. So right now, that is the state of play on this. But there are so many questions. Remember, Joe, we already have the tariffs on steel and aluminum. We've got the auto tariffs kicking in Thursday already. We've got the auto parts tariffs kicking in some point in the next month, but not on USMCA goods. The USMCA auto tariffs kick in maybe after that. The copper, lumber, chips, and pharma tariffs may be coming after that. And we already have the fentanyl-related tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico, which also have a USMCA carve-out that has been sort of thought would bridge to today's announcement, but it's unclear.
And that's about to expire, correct?
Well, no. Trump has called it a 1-month delay, but that is not how they enacted it. It is on the books until he changes it. So right now, the White House isn't saying, well, is Liberation Day going to just kind of replace some of the stopgap stuff that they've done?
Yeah.
We don't know. So conceivably, if it doesn't replace it, you could have a double impact on China, Canada, and Mexico. So anyway, needless to say, this is all swirling and up in the air. Of course, other administrations would presumably have this baked by now. I realize that people listening and outside of the U.S. might think this is a little fly by the seat of the pants, but
people in
Trump,
the U.S. think it is.
Right, sure. But President Trump likes having his aides debate these kind of things, so I guess it's not too unusual in the sort of landscape of where they're at. Remember, last week on the auto tariffs, it was fluid throughout the day as well.
Yes, sure. So seems like we've heard 2 really important messages, and I'm sure you could add more to this, but from my view, we heard President Trump say in the Oval Office, sitting next to Kid Rock, that the tariffs would be substantially lower. That was the term he used than some expected. We would be relatively kind. We'd be kind in relation to what they're doing to us. But we also heard Scott Bessent say that we're going to start at the top, and then we're going to pull them back as the concessions start rolling in. So how do you get both?
Well, I will say Trump is saying that they're going to be kind against his perception of what they are doing to the U.S., right? Remember, the reciprocal tariffs were calculated not just on tariffs, but on non-tariff barriers, which isn't unusual in the trade world, but also on things like VATs and sales taxes. That is unusual in the trade world. So measured against this sort of everything in the cart approach that Trump was talking about, it might be nicer than that, but it would still be a fairly significant tariff if they went down that road, that avenue. What Secretary Bessent is signaling, I think, is interesting and people should take note of, is, he is nodding to something that Trump has said on and off, that this is all in negotiation, that if whatever number he comes up with, let's say you're the EU, and he comes up with a number today, we don't know that the EU is being targeted, but he's always complained about them, so certainly all signs are pointing that way. And then a week from now, the EU decides to, instead of retaliating, lower its own tariffs. Conceivably, the U.S. might pull back its own. But of course, he's creating political dynamics in some countries where they're compelled to respond, at least partially. And that is what is fueling fears of some sort of spiraling trade war that, of course, either weighs on growth or full on drives things into a downturn. So
you wonder if in the weeks ahead it's going to be a parade of world leaders all coming back to Washington to talk about their specific cases and try to zero things out. We're going to talk later with Doug Ford, who I mentioned. The Ontario Premier was on the other network this morning, calling it Termination Day, and suggested that Canada was prepared to drop all of its tariffs.
You're making me put my Canada hat on now, hey?
Well, that's just,
say hello to the
it's
Premier
close to home. We will. In fact, I'd be curious to hear what you would ask him later. But if you saw a development like that, Donald Trump says, hey, this is working, right?
the tone has been night and day under Prime Minister Carney from Prime Minister Trudeau. Now, Canada's in an election, so this is tricky. And I think that whatever happens today vis-a-vis Canada, we will see a response from Carney, who remains Prime Minister even though it's in an election. But I think the sort of overall grand bargain that President Trump has talked to is going to have to wait until after the election, which in Canada, it's a multi-party system, but fundamentally the polls are showing it's either one of two guys, either the conservative Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney, the current incumbent. So we'll see. Trump's interventions, I should note, have aligned heavily with the resurgence of the Liberal Party, which was Trudeau and Carney's party in the polls. So we'll see where that goes, but I do think you will see a more scalpel-like approach from Prime Minister Carney. At least that's what he's been signaling. Than you saw with Prime Minister Trudeau, who generally, but not always, went dollar for dollar on U.S. tariffs. And of course, the economies are just such different scales that tends to exact a price. I got hit by one of them, Joe. Did I tell you this? I got hit by a tariff. Yeah. So I'm a veteran of these tariff wars.
What are we talking
already.
about?
One of the Canadian counter tariffs on the steel tariffs hit a prefabricated shed that I bought from New York State.
Wow.
And was shipping to a family place in Canada. Got hit, man.
25%?
Dagger to the heart. 25%.
Dagger to the heart.
Fabricated material. Yeah,
wow, we're straddled in the border right here together.
I was like 3 days from the border. Anyway, so
the White House
I have
listening to this?
experience. And guess what? China did not pay that tariff. Just in case there was
No
any confusion
kidding.
about that.
The Wingroves may have paid
right,
that
the
tariff.
Wingrove
Okay,
household
so
paid that tariff.
This is a real-world example you brought to us.
Because it was either me or our dear friends, the Amish of upstate New York, that were going to pay that.
Well, they're not going to talk about that in the Rose Garden today, I suspect.
No.
What do we expect from this event? All we really know is the entire cabinet, I'm told, is going to be there. There's going to be a big banner that says "Make America Wealthy Again." Do we get the Thunderbirds fly over like the beginning of a NASCAR? Like they could come right over the colonnade.
That'd be great.
Over the Rose
why
Garden.
not? Why not? I think we're going to, we'll preach to the faithful is what today will be about.
News conference style?
There will be a news conference element, I imagine. Trump typically can't help himself, but I should say I'm guessing on that. Our reporting and the reporting of others is that there will be other guests, like blue-collar worker types.
Okay.
There's some reporting around steel workers, for instance. Now, the steel industry, Trump is trying to put the focus there because that industry loves the tariffs. The steel makers of America like a tariff on steel.
Sure.
The trick is everyone that uses steel doesn't like it.
How true.
Because, of course, those costs get passed on to them. So other industries, like the car industry, are less jazzed about it. And around these other tariffs, much less support. So Trump is going to try to focus on his own cabinet, who, of course, support this, or at least haven't spoken out against it, and the workers who like it.
I wonder if there'll be Teslas parked in the driveway, 100% assembled in the USA. I'd love to see the Thunderbirds if we can arrange for that. Josh Wingrove, thank you. Look for his byline on the terminal and online, helping us cover everything today at the White House on Bloomberg. Great to see you on this Liberation Day, as they're calling it, at the White House. We'll see if the markets agree. Once we get details from President Trump, again, they're going to come after the bell. We'll carry it for you live, presumably 4 p.m. It could start later than that, as things tend to run a little late at the White House. Now we're going to have a special extended edition of Balance of Power starting 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll carry you up to 7 p.m. as we decipher what the president said, and then what we will likely hear in terms of clarifying remarks or actual paper in the form of executive orders following that event here. One of the other major stories that we're covering today is something that we're going to be getting into right now with regard to what happened last evening in Wisconsin and in Florida. Coming up is our conversation with Julia Azari, but we do have a breaker here with what's going on in the political world of Eric Adams. Just breaking on the terminal a short time ago, as you might have heard, the judge permanently ending corruption case against the mayor of New York. A federal judge dismissed the charges against Eric Adams, bringing what is a permanent end to the case. There was a bit of an argument about whether charges should be refiled, and we have a chance to catch up quickly on this breaker with June Grasso, host of Bloomberg Law. She's with us from World Headquarters in New York. June, what's this all about? Is this case over or not?
Case is over. The government got what it wanted in one respect, but not in the other, because the judge slammed the government over and over and over again in his decision. The government wanted to be able to bring charges against Eric Adams in the future, and the judge said, no, I'm going to dismiss this with prejudice, meaning you can't bring that again. He said it wasn't right to have leverage over the mayor of New York. But the judge also characterized this this agreement as everything here smacks of a bargain, dismissal of the indictment in exchange for immigration policy concessions. And he just took down each of the Justice Department's arguments for why they wanted to dismiss the case. For example, it was brought for political reasons. He said, no, zero evidence that it was brought for political reasons. Another reason, the mayor, if he has to litigate this case, won't be able to deal with the immigration policy concerns. He said, no, again, he said the mayor dealt with immigration policy concerns right after this by letting ICE into Rikers, which the judge said may not be in compliance with New York's law. So he had a lot to say, though he had really no choice but to dismiss the case.
With this now less than 3 months before the primary election in the New York City mayoral race, he can still run then, right? He's a candidate.
Absolutely. And his lawyer had written yesterday asking the judge to hand down a decision quickly because of the deadlines coming up in that race. The judge also mentioned, however, whenever something is dismissed in this case or something happens, Eric Adams or his lawyers come out and say, this shows that Mayor Adams is innocent of all charges. The judge said, this is not an indication of guilt or innocence. I'm not ruling based on that. And I think he did that deliberately because he knew that we're going to hear choruses from the Adams camp that this means that he was innocent or not guilty of those charges. But yeah, he's going to run, and we'll see how much this plays in. As you know, he already has horrible approval ratings in New York City. So we'll see how much this plays in and his tie to the Trump administration.
Well, pretty neat bow to put on this one. June Grasso, thank you so much. Bloomberg Law with much more to follow this evening. A federal judge dismissing corruption charges against Eric Adams. There you go. Nice and clean. June, thank you very much. There's nothing more dangerous than when a journalist is looking for a trend story, and that is exactly what I am going to do right now with the analysis this morning coming out of Wisconsin and Florida. Hey, first great day of the year for Democrats is the headline in the tip sheets this morning. Add Cory Booker at 25 hours on the Senate floor, and it's a brand new day. I may be going a little far, but what happened last evening in Florida, of course, by the way, Republicans won, but not by nearly as much as would have been expected. Certainly that 6th district of Florida, the Mike Waltz seat we talked about, a Trump win of 30-plus points. Didn't turn out quite like that for the Republican candidate, but those seats are preserved. Democrats may be claiming a moral victory. We're going to point more to what happened last evening in Wisconsin, the Democratic win, the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, the one that Elon Musk invested tens of millions of dollars in, making it the most expensive judicial battle in American history. Went to the Democrat last evening. A 10-point spread. Judge Susan Crawford handily beat Judge Brad Schimmel in her victory speech last night. Listen.
Today, Wisconsinites fended off an unprecedented attack on our democracy, and Wisconsins stood up and said loudly that justice does not have a price. Our courts are not for sale.
I don't know if Julia Azari will indulge me on my trend story, but that's why we turn to an expert. Professor of Political Science, Marquette University. Julia, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg, and good to see you. Am I onto something here, or are we making way too much about a couple of statewide races less than 100 days into the Trump administration?
Well, I have kind of complicated thoughts about that. And I want to echo what you had said about the kind of the significance of this race in Wisconsin. As someone who lives in Wisconsin, this morning, I have to admit, was a little lonely because by 10 a.m. I didn't have 15 text messages telling me to vote. It's been a very intense period here in Wisconsin, and it's also been, I can attest, very nationalized and with a lot of emphasis on the race really being about Elon Musk and Donald Trump, not so much about state level judicial issues. As far as thinking about a trend, here's how I would think about it. We often see this happen in the special elections that unfold over the course of an odd year after a presidential election. We often see the president's party lose, and that, or whatever we want to call this with the judicial election, technically nonpartisan, it's clear what the sides were. We often see that. We often see, and that sort of foreshadows the midterm losses that we often see for the president's party. But what I want to emphasize from my perspective as someone who studies this is that it's not as automatic as I think the trend would have us believe. And what it actually reflects is political mobilization and organization. And the way I would think about this and what I would look for is how much do some of these results reflect that organization and mobilization on the ground? And certainly you would see that in Wisconsin. And so that would be the lens I would also turn to some of these other races where Republicans underperformed their usual electoral returns. Was that the result of kind of voters experiencing some kind of remorse or voters responding to an administration? Was it also the result of real organization on the ground, mobilizing some voters and not others, and emphasizing bringing national issues into that conversation?
What does this say about Elon Musk? Because he not only made this the most expensive judicial race in U.S. history, he said a lot. He was out there with the cheese head. We all saw this, giving out $1 million checks. He said this race would decide the future of America and Western civilization. Why was he so keyed into Wisconsin?
Right. I mean, I think, who knows? But it's not wrong that this is a state where a lot of things end up kind of being decided, where this is a key swing state. We have a number of judicial issues that could come before the court, including the legislative maps and also a trigger abortion law from 1849. So, these are really forefront issues. I think even before the 2024 election, even before this race and Elon Musk, certainly it was important to look at what was going on in Wisconsin to understand national trends. As far as Musk, one thing that I like to say after these off-year elections is that they often kind of tell us stories that we already know. And the story that we already know is that Elon Musk isn't very popular. That and particularly like billionaires are not very popular. I have all sorts of survey data that attests to this. People are not crazy about the power of the wealthy. Sorry if this is the wrong venue for that comment. Musk, you asked me to share my expert opinion, and I'm looking at these open-ended survey responses unbidden. People often talk about wealth and billionaires, and Musk didn't.
I work for the radio
try
network,
to hide that,
Julia.
Right?
There's no billionaires around here you have to worry about. It's just us.
Okay, good. I'm safe with my fellow media content creators, but
you are.
Yeah, that's my takeaway. Is this isn't really popular? Wisconsinites are a little bit difficult to read politically. It's very much a purple state. It has potentially sort of shifted from being a state that's purple because there are a lot of independent swing voters to a state that's purple because there are a lot of passionate partisans, and so every election is a question of which ones will show up. But whatever it is a state with a strong sort of populist history and populist background. And so it's not surprising to me that the idea that someone would come in from out of the state and kind of flaunt their wealth as a means of political power would not go over that well.
Mm-hmm. You probably heard the story or read the story of Politico magazine, Donald Trump telling his inner circle that Elon's going to be wrapping up soon, packing up his toys and stepping back in the coming weeks from his current role as a governing partner. Is Donald Trump getting a sense of what you're feeling, or will they say his work is done, or both?
Yeah, good question. We'll find out over the next couple of months. It's not terribly unusual to have some staff turnover in response to these sorts of, in response to a political development or in response to a policy development. And Musk's role is very strange. He occupies a kind of mentally, I think, the role that we often attribute to a chief of staff, but he's not playing that role at all. He is not managing the Trump White House. They won't be totally straightforward about what he's doing, but clearly he's deeply involved in the sort of policy impact of cutting government. And I think that if there's a sense that that's unpopular, part of Musk's strange role is that it makes him pretty easy to get rid of. He's not Senate confirmed. He's not even really in a clear and official role. So I think there was always maybe a sense that he would be the fall guy.
You should come by more often, Julia Azari. I was excited to hear you were coming on, and great to see you. Professor of Political Science, Marquette University, as part of our conversation today on Bloomberg. I still wonder, where does Elon Musk live in town? Did he get a property? Does he have an apartment? Is renting a house, or is he parked at a hotel? Maybe he really is sleeping in the office every night. I guess he can do that for 130 days. Look, we've got a lot more to talk about here, and we'll assemble our panel coming up next on Bloomberg with a conversation ahead as well with Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary. We'll have it for you here on Bloomberg. So yeah, we're working our way toward 4 o'clock. And we're going to bring you the president's comments live from the Rose Garden. It's a nice day in Washington. He'll have the cabinet with him. Make America wealthy again, we're told. We'll read the banner, and he could be surrounding himself with some stakeholders here. If you're with us on YouTube, welcome. Search Bloomberg Business News Live if you want to find us here in studio and coming up with a conversation with Larry Summers. It's a good time to jump in here. We've got an extended edition of Balance of Power this evening, 5 to 7 p.m., because it might take us a minute to distill what the president says. And before we actually see some paper this evening, there's going to be an opportunity to clarify some of his remarks and get a sense of what could be a complicated picture, potentially a combination of reciprocal tariffs, sectoral tariffs, and beyond. That is what we're going to be listening for at 4. There'll be market reaction to deal with, of course, tomorrow, but we want to get you the nuts and bolts here. And to be able to get some time with Larry Summers is going to be important. David Weston, of course, our colleague here at Bloomberg, is going to be bringing us that conversation in a couple of moments. Stuart Paul from Bloomberg Economics is also with this part of the conversation today on Balance of Power, and here from New York. Stuart, this is a market that's on edge. We know how Larry Summers feels about tariffs. And Donald Trump is going to try to make an argument today, I guess, to try to give the markets religion on this. The argument so far has been short-term pain, long-term gain. But I think John Kennedy, the senator from Louisiana, Republican senator, may have said it best from one of the tip sheets this morning as we consider the idea of Liberation Day. He said, in the long run, it'll probably work. The problem is that in the long run, we're all dead. Is that how the market sees this?
That's how the market's been seeing it for most of the month. It looks like equities are catching a bit of a bid today, so we could be seeing a little bit of folks starting to buy on the news as we get closer to actually receiving news. When I do the actual modeling myself, there is very little to actually be gained from tariffs. If Trump were to take a maximalist approach, raising the effective U.S. tariff rate to around 35% from just about 5%, a bit over 5% right now, we would actually shave about 4 percentage points off of cumulative real GDP growth. We don't really see any major positive economy-wide benefits from implementing these tariffs. The thing is, and this is always a problem with tariffs, is that the costs are really dispersed. They're very wide across the entire economy. The benefits are actually relatively narrow. They could benefit the domestic auto producers, for example. And that could be the objective of the administration, to benefit just certain folks in certain states. But from an economy-wide perspective, very few benefits.
Mm-hmm. All right, Stuart, let's put an ear on this conversation with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, speaking with David Weston. This is live on
tariffs. First, set the stage. What's at stake?
These are very consequential economic policies. They're consequential for prices. They're consequential for employment. They're consequential for America's foreign relations. They're consequential for national security. And frankly, I think the question is mostly how much damage is going to be done. You know, if you think about it, David, it's kind of a remarkable thing that this is the centerpiece of their economic program, and they're so nervous about its market impact that they have to announce it after the markets have closed. So it seems a kind of bizarre strategy, which I've been watching government policies a lot. I've never seen an announcement that was delayed until after the market closed, where the government was the one that was making the announcement. And frankly, it's a bit naive as a strategy, since the indices and the futures continue to trade. So insofar as there's a market impact that's playing out, we'll still see it almost immediately.
You're a distinguished macroeconomist with a lot of extensive experience in Washington dealing with the economy. What would you normally expect if, as predicted, we have substantial tariffs, however they're parsed out? We have a supply shock. Is that related to a demand shock?
So As far as markets are concerned, it's all going to be about what happens relative to what people expected. And markets have traded down a lot over the last couple of weeks because people think that this is going to be bad. As far as the economic impact is concerned, the proximate impact is higher prices. When you have higher prices and people's incomes don't adjust immediately, they have less money to spend on other things. And that means less demand, and that means fewer people employed, and that means less need for capacity expansion and less investment. And so this is a classic supply shock. The basic economics of this situation are just like the economics of an increase in the price of oil, which is always seen as the classic example of a hard stagflation kind of problem. And of course, it puts the Federal Reserve in a very difficult position because usually all the signs go one way. But when inflation is going up, that would be a reason to raise interest rates. When unemployment's going up, that would be a reason to reduce interest rates. And so it puts the Federal Reserve in a very difficult position. So we'll have to see how these tariffs are administered, just what form they take before we can make an estimate of what the cumulative impact is going to be. But the direction of the impact is, I think, something that almost all economists would agree on. What is also surprising about this is that, yeah, economists always think protectionism is bad, but not all protectionism is equally bad. And a bunch of what the Trump administration is doing seems to me, bad within the category of protectionism. Think, for example, of the tariffs on steel and aluminum. 60 times as many people work in industries that use those inputs as work in industries that produce steel and aluminum. So when you tariff inputs to American producers, it's not even good mercantilism. You're reducing the competitiveness of the producers. And so even if you just focus on things in terms of competitiveness and you don't think about the consumer interest at all, you're doing something that's counterproductive. And the other thing is, this is like a football team that's trying to run a play in practice without a defense. This is going to hurt our economy before we get to any possible retaliation. And it's clear from what's been said, whether it's Canada or whether it's Europe or whether it's China, that there's going to be retaliation, perhaps retaliation in tariff forms, perhaps retaliation in terms of discrimination against other customers. And on top of that, you have the psychological effect. You know, there's data in the last few days suggesting that just because people are angry and upset, the demand for Teslas is down significantly because people are unhappy with Elon Musk. Well, that kind of effect is going to attach to American producers around the world because everybody's thinking that their traditional friend has turned against them. So this is the kind of thing you discuss in the way that we would usually discuss an oil price spike or an earthquake or a drought, but as a supply shock, but it's a thing we're doing to ourselves.
This is not the only action from the Trump administration that's causing a lot of turmoil. One of them is close to you, and you've talked about, and that is the move by the administration against certain elite universities, including your Harvard, and with a possible, as I've seen it, possibly $9 billion up for review. What are your thoughts about that?
Look, there is a lot that should be fixed at Harvard and should be fixed at other elite universities. And in some ways, it is shameful that there hasn't been more done to address anti-Semitism, that there have been real excesses on DEI, and the universities should have done more, much more quickly to address that. But make no mistake, David, this is an authoritarian attempt to chill and punish potential adversaries. President Trump and his administration have made common cause with the neo-Nazi AfD. There's a track record of who they've been in contact with and who supports them. This is not a genuine concern about anti-Semitism, and this is not a genuine concern about universities. They're going after judges, they're going after law firms, they're going after companies. So this is an attempt at being authoritarian towards your adversaries. And what we know from history is that there's a lot of contagion. When people capitulate, people decide it's hopeless and more people capitulate. When people have rectitude and stand up against it, it gives others strength. If Harvard University, with a $52 billion endowment, with its enormous prestige, with an alumni network in every aspect of American leadership second to none, if it cannot resist this authoritarian tendency, who can? So there is an enormous amount that is at stake here.
Okay, Larry, thank you so very much for being with us on this important day. That's Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, now of Harvard. Back to you.
All right, many thanks, David Weston, for the conversation with the former Treasury Secretary live here on Bloomberg Radio, on satellite radio channel 121, and on YouTube, where you can dial us up right now ahead of our second hour. Search Bloomberg Business News Live to find our live stream on YouTube. You're going to want to keep it up and let it run today, because it's not only this program as we walk up to the announcement on tariffs, but an extended edition of Balance of Power that'll start at 5 p.m. Eastern time. We might be in the throes of an announcement from the Rose Garden at that time, and we're going to stay live until 7 p.m. When I say we, I mean Kailey, Leinz, and myself. Kailey is with me in Washington right now. This is an interesting moment as the market kind of holds its breath here. Yeah. The market is Donald Trump, no more than ever like today.
Well, absolutely, because no one but Donald Trump, and that would include all market participants, can say with certainty what is going to be announced this afternoon. As of Bloomberg's latest reporting, could be blanket tariffs on all trading partners, could be targeted different levels of tariffs depending on the tariff level the country charges the U.S. We really just don't know what ultimately this is going to look like. Everyone is waiting with bated breath. There's a chance we could get a combination here, right? We've got potentially a scored tiered system, potentially when we talk about reciprocals, but as well sectoral tariffs. Josh Wingrove is reminding us as well, by the way, that there's still a lack of clarity on Mexico and Canada tariffs that went up for review, but we may hear more about this evening. Well, and as the former Treasury Secretary was just pointing out, it's one thing for the U.S. to announce what it is intending to do. Then we get to the retaliatory measures countries like Canada or whatever other trading partner may inflict back on the U.S. That's why tomorrow and Friday could actually be even bigger news days. But we're going to start with what we know here in Washington. Stay with us for hour 2 of Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics, straight ahead right here on Bloomberg. And don't forget to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Apple or Spotify, wherever you do your podcasts, and subscribe. Watch us live on YouTube, as I mentioned, and listen always at Bloomberg.com.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Today, we finally get answers. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as President Trump prepares to finally deliver news on tariffs and what, of course, he's been calling Liberation Day. We still have a lot of questions, but there's an announcement set to coincide with the closing bell today. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kailey, this could include across-the-board tariffs, sectoral tariffs, retaliatory tariffs. maybe all three?
Yeah, it's quite literally anyone's guess to this point. We should have more clarity in 3 hours, though it's unclear if we'll have all the clarity we in financial markets actually desire. Because even if we do get an announcement today of tariffs of whatever level on whatever country, there's not necessarily any telling how long exactly they will remain in place.
That's right.
It depends whether they are intended to be used as a negotiating tactic or if this is actually something that is meant to raise revenue for the United States in the long term.
To think that we're still asking that is pretty remarkable, considering how much talk we've had about tariffs. But word from our team at the White House is these details are still being hammered out. This is still an in-motion situation, a fluid situation in Washington. So 4 p.m. is the scheduled start time. We've got conversations with some smart people before and after. We'll have an extended edition of Balance of Power this evening, Kailey, because this could take some time to unfold.
Yeah, and we'll have some smart conversations this hour, too, as we look ahead in anticipation, including from Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana, who has expressed some concern around tariff policies and how it could impact farm states like his, not just in terms of the cost of imports, but also what's going to happen to U.S. exports if there's retaliatory tariffs put into place.
Not to mention the impact it may have on the debate over extending the Trump tax cuts, which is a major priority for the members.
Yeah, in fact, the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, was just meeting with the president and other officials about that today. So we have a lot to cover this hour, obviously, in the markets are basically waiting to hurry up and close so we can get this tariff announcement from President Trump. But let's look at where we're trading right now. Charlie Pellet is in New York with a chat. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Kailey. Leinz. We got stocks higher across the board. Obviously, Trump tariffs, the big story. We got you covered on Bloomberg Television and Radio, 4 o'clock Wall Street time when it all comes down. But I got two other major stories we're following right now. President Trump telling his inner circle that Elon Musk will be stepping back from his advisory role in coming weeks. Now, this is according to Politico, and moments ago, the White House reacted to that report, calling it, quote, garbage. The other major business story we're following right now, a source tells Bloomberg, Amazon.com has submitted a bid to the White House to buy the social video app TikTok from its Chinese owners. Again, Amazon shares, they are advancing on that report. Right now, we got Amazon ripping higher. Part of a broader tech rally, but we got Amazon right now up by 2.7%. All about tariffs with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ advancing. S&P up 47 right now, 56.80 on the S&P, up by about 0.8%. The Dow up 293 now, up 0.7%. NASDAQ up 209 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain there of 1.2%. Your 10-year at 4.21% with the 2-year 3.92%. Gold up $16 the ounce, 31.30 where we stand, up 0.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.7%, 71.71 a barrel. And Bitcoin up 2% right now, 86,990 on Bitcoin. Tesla's vehicle sales down 13% in the first quarter, dragged down by the changeover of its most important model and international backlash against Elon Musk. Tesla shares today up by 4.3%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu, busy day, and Kailey Leinz.
Busy day indeed. Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Charlie reminding us that President Trump has a pretty packed agenda today. It's not just about the Rose Garden announcement at 4 p.m. Eastern time. As we just mentioned, he already had a meeting on taxes with Senate leadership as they work on budget reconciliation. He's also expected to have a meeting at the White House today with parties interested in buying TikTok ahead of that deadline on Saturday. And then we get to tariffs. And I just wonder if he hasn't made up his mind on that yet. When's the time to do it when you have so much on the calendar?
Does that mean Jeff Bezos is going to be in the Rose Garden later on as Amazon enters the fray here?
Yeah,
Larry
possibly.
Ellison, Oracle. It's going to be a who's who later on.
Yeah, certainly. And of course, all the cabinet, many members of Congress will be gathered there as well. All of them probably wanting the same answers we do, which is what exactly is the plan? Because basically the entire District of Columbia is still in the dark on that.
That's true enough. Never mind the budget, but that's a whole other situation if you're in the District of Columbia. We're going to talk to Marlin Stutzman, the Republican congressman, back with us today on Bloomberg to get his sense. As we mentioned, we're trying to feel our way through this. Our political panel will also weigh in today with not just, of course, the economics at play, but the politics. This White House would tell you promises made, promises kept.
No, that has been the line. The question is, does it ultimately mean that while he makes the promises on delivering things like tariffs and tax cuts, the economy doesn't necessarily reap the reward he promised it would?
How true. Anna Wong is with us. She knows a little bit about this. Of course, chief U.S. economist at Bloomberg Economics, formerly of the first Trump administration. And it's great to see you. Welcome back to Balance of Power. This is all gut check from here, right? What do you think we're going to find out at 4 o'clock?
Well, we're just reading the tea leaves just as everybody else in the market. So the way I read the tea leaves is we have heard from Carolina Levitt that the tariffs will be effective immediately. That's one clue. Second clue is that Besson told lawmakers in a private meeting that these announced tariffs would be a cap, quote unquote. And Trump also mentioned that he has made up his mind a long time ago. I think if you put all these dots together, it sounded like to me that it's looking like a very simple kind of either universal tariff of 10 to 20% or tiered between with one group at 10%, another group at 20%. Something quite simple rather than a country by country reciprocal, I match you, you match me, that type of tariffs, given all these clues.
Okay, so while we obviously don't know that for certain, I do wonder, whatever it is that we end up with, Anna, how much does it matter if they take effect immediately, how long they last? Because whatever the levy is that's initially announced, businesses will have to adjust to right away, right? Even if it's suddenly removed in 2 weeks, 2 months, who knows how long. How much does longevity matter?
So let's think about how much does the businesses have in terms of the cushion of waiting for that uncertainty. So we have seen that firms have front-run these tariffs in the last 3 or 4 months, right? From what I heard, businesses have enough inventory to last for three months without raising prices because they bought these inventories using the old prices, right? So basically by around summer, midsummer, I would say July or August is when businesses have to make a choice on should I buy more to rebuild my inventory at these higher prices, and should I pass on these prices or should I take a margin hit, right? And so I think the time we have until where these negotiations would take place immediately after these tariffs would be between now to July. And I think that the administration will lower tariffs for certain countries, but there are some structural barriers with, for example, China and EU that I think the administration would be a higher bar for them to be lowering the tariffs. But from the perspective of firms, I think overall, after this announcement, they will think that tariffs will. I mean, ultimately, the terminal level of tariff wouldn't be what it would be at the end of today. It would be somewhat lower, and our base case is that ultimately it would be hanging around between 10 to 15% effective, compared to today, which is about 4.5%.
So still big.
Yeah, still big increase.
So we could well see a parade of world leaders lining up in the West Wing starting tomorrow for the next couple of weeks.
Starting yesterday.
Well, I suppose that is true, actually. But the analysis we're hearing in many cases is that until that happens, and maybe even with that happening, this is a win for China, holding its first economic dialogue with Japan and South Korea in years. The potential of a trade deal that might not include the United States with some of our trading partners here. How real is that?
How real is that? Joe, is that all South Korea, Japan, and China are three of the biggest trade surplus countries in the world. So how is the three trade surplus country, they are all selling to the U.S., so how are they going to create the demand for each other's market all of a sudden when they have been selling to the same country for years?
So you don't buy the fact that China wins?
I hear the same logic applies to how EU could counter the U.S., but they are all in the same boat. If you look at a very striking picture that someone like Brad Setzer posted on Twitter, the global imbalance is when you look on one side, all the trade surplus country, on the other side, trade deficit country. The trade deficit is completely dominated by U.S. in the world. The U.S. is the consumer of the last resort. How are these countries going to create a pact to absorb each other's excess supply?
The demand's just not there, is your point.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess by extension, as President Trump talks about these tariffs as basically being a way to entice more manufacturing in the U.S., what is the point of having greater American manufacturing if you don't necessarily have greater outside of the country buyers for that? Can the demand be generated by the United States alone? They have to have some kind of end market to bring all these goods to.
I think he's thinking more about producing for ourselves in mind. I think.
But does that justify the investment that would be needed to build these factories and hire these workers?
Look, I think economists like myself, we tend to have less short-sighted view of the world. We care about whether there's a recession tomorrow or, what will happen in a year's time. But people like President Trump and his economic advisors are thinking about 4 years ahead, 8 years ahead. So should there be a war, say, because lately there has been more news about like signals of wars, then I think U.S. would be well positioned to have steel in the country. That's just one example of why there would be a steel and aluminum tariffs. I'm not justifying them, but I'm just saying it's an insurance against a national security outcome that could potentially be very costly.
Well, it's interesting because the White House has justified tariffs on national security concerns. We've heard from Howard Lutnick, this is not a trade war, this is a drug war when it comes to Mexico and Canada. We've heard when it comes to Europe and our other partners that this is about simple fairness. At some point, you have to pick one, don't you?
It's actually all those things, Joe.
Is it?
So I believe that there's really not a good case for our trade war with Canada and Mexico, for example, because we're this North America region so integrated, and then also there are allies for years and years. So for those, I don't see a structural tariffs vis-a-vis those countries. But there are other countries where the tariff barriers would take a higher bar to be lowered eventually, where there are structural barriers.
So keeping in mind, Anna, that we're getting this news in the week, we also get a payrolls report. As we consider not what is happening in the labor market now, but with that longer term view of what could be happening in the labor market in the future, if we're dealing with companies that have higher input costs, how quickly could that translate to trying to cost cut elsewhere with reductions in headcount, or at the very least not expansions in headcount?
Yeah, so, I read that the Trump economic advisors are expecting a solid payroll report this Friday. And that's actually what we are expecting as well, just given how data are behaving. But so I think that their view is that the hard data, the solid hard data, especially in the jobs market so far, does not stop them from doing what they want to do. It is when the stock market, the labor market, sorry, not stock market, it's not stock market, it's the labor market, that when labor markets start tanking is when you will start to see more pivot from Trump and this willingness to take deals from other countries. And I think we are getting to that point. We are expecting the labor market to slow more visibly at the end of third quarter. But even at the end of March, looking at the daily payrolls data that we track, we're starting to see a faster deceleration in the pace of job growth. So I think next month's data, not this Friday's data, would be much worse than this month.
All right, Anna Wong, Chief U.S. Economist at Bloomberg Economics. Thank you so much for joining us, as, of course, we're trying to get as many economic takes to these policies ahead of their announcement as we can, including, of course, from those who have to make monetary policy decisions based off of what ultimately will happen. That would include, of course, the Federal Reserve. And actually, the Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee talked about tariffs on Fox earlier.
The problem of tariffs is they're a supply shock. At the end of the day, imports are about 11% of the economy. The fear is if it jumps out of the 11% lane, either the tariffs start applying to components and parts and intermediate goods, as the economists call it, and raise the cost of production for other industries, or people start freaking out and change their behavior. And if the consumer stops spending or business stops investing because they're uncertain or they're afraid where we're headed, that would be a bit of a mess.
So we want to get another take on all of this now and turn to Congressman Marlin Stutzman, the Republican representing Indiana's 3rd District, who is back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, always good to see you here on Balance of Power. For your constituents in the 3rd District in Indiana, what is the ideal outcome of this Rose Garden announcement? What balance do you hope President Trump strikes when it comes to tariffs?
Well, I think, Kailey, in the long run, the goal is to have free and fair trade. One of the things that has happened over time is that other countries have, tariffed American goods going into their country, but we have very low tariffs on those countries. For example, Brazil. They charge 35% tariffs on U.S. cars going into Brazil, where we only charge them 2.5% coming into the United States. And I understand that, some countries don't have the competitive advantages that we do, but we're the largest economy, and we should also believe that our partners, whether it's Brazil or whether it's the European Union or Japan and others, that it's good for both sides. And over time, what's happened is tariffs have built up against the American producer, and I think that what President Trump is doing today is leveling the playing field. There needs to be a reset to make sure that American productivity is respected and protected.
So are you hoping then for a targeted approach today from President Trump, or should it be an across-the-board levy and we'll bring things down as countries respond?
Well, I don't know. We'll see what President Trump lays out, but I know from as we look through different situations, one, for example, is Australian beef. I come from Northeast Indiana. We're in the agricultural space and manufacturing space. And my guess is that President Trump will take a targeted approach at where he thinks it will have the most impact, but then also where, reciprocal tariffs could be de-escalated, and hopefully other countries will say, well, look, we could back these all down to zero. Let's have a free and fair trade. But for example, with Australian beef, all the way back to mad cow, if you remember, which has almost been 20 years ago, but Australia banned American beef from going to Australia. But America, we take a large amount of Australian beef here into the United States. And one of those breeds particular that I'm familiar with is Wagyu. And Australian Wagyu is about 50% of the American consumption. And so they're not willing to buy any of our product in Australia because of the ban. And so I believe that, we should tariff their beef coming into the United States. That way we have a conversation. And I'll tell you already, Joe, that they're calling and wanting to talk. And it's like, well, why do you have the ban on from 20 years ago? We're friends. Let's have a reciprocal relationship when it comes to beef. And so I think that's also the tool that President Trump is using, is to have those conversations with countries that they just simply have been ignored on the tariff issue for many, many years.
But should it, Congressman, actually be President Trump's tool to use? Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Is this really the right way to go about it? Isn't your role as a legislator to tackle things like this, not the role of the executive?
Well, I think, we work together. I'm not sure that every, member of Congress supports every tariff. I'm sure that it's going to go district by district in some cases. For us, in the 3rd district, we're a heavy manufacturing district. So the steel industry, which has a heavy presence in the Fort Wayne area, this is going to be helpful. Agriculture, there's some uncertainty about it. But I think that President Trump is really leading on this, and then we can codify, or we can have that debate in Congress. But I think the fact that he's leading on it is really helpful. He can take, the perspective from a macro level and talk about where there's inconsistencies or imbalances. And then, those of us in Congress, we can react accordingly. But I know that the America First agenda is a top priority for the Republican conference in the House. Speaker Mike Johnson has also been working very closely with President Trump on so many different issues that I know that the leadership for the House Republican Conference will be leading on this issue as well, supporting the president.
At one point, the conversation was about raising revenue, Congressman, and that revenue was going to help to pay for extending the Trump tax cuts. Is that still part of the picture here, or are you waiting to learn that like we are today?
I think it's still part of the picture. It was in a meeting the other day where the Congressional Budget Office actually said that they would consider taking in some of the tariff revenue as part of the budget as we're working through that. That was new information. We were told at the beginning of the year that they wouldn't consider tariff revenue for budgetary conversations, but I think that it should. And so I think as this moves forward, the picture will become more clear over time. But I don't necessarily see it just as a revenue piece. I really do see it as a trade balance where we have to reset with a lot of countries around the world who are our friends. And think about the money that we have spent as Americans globally for the defense of allies, and not only for ourselves but for the defense of our allies, that we've never received anything back for that. And so I think that the relationships that we have, we're a very generous nation, we're a very giving nation, and I know that Americans love to give, but at the same time, when there's $36 trillion of debt, we have a deficit and an economy that is struggling. There's got to be a new look at things, and that's what President Trump has done and brought the tariff conversation to the table.
Well, we're glad to have your perspective on this, Congressman, as you sit on the Budget Committee in the House. Meantime, the Budget Committee in the Senate and the chair of it, Lindsey Graham, it was suggested by Senate Republican leadership yesterday, could have the power to decide the policy baseline of the Senate's budget blueprint on his own, even if the parliamentarian doesn't rule that the current policy baseline is appropriate. Does that give you concern about the potential future of this legislation? Does it have to come from the Senate parliamentarian for it to have your confidence that it can get all the way through both chambers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually in a meeting yesterday with the Treasury Secretary, Besant, who was talking a little bit about this. He was actually getting ready to go down to the Senate to have a meeting, and that was one of the topics that was brought up. And, and I think that, on both sides of the chamber, both sides of the House and the Senate want to, follow the process, but there's also concern about the parliamentarians' position and authority and their opinion or her opinion, and then also, Congressional Budget Office is another one. So I think that Scott Bessent has been doing a fantastic job of helping with the discussion and looking at this from a perspective, because the scoring that the CBO takes doesn't always take in dynamic scoring. And one thing that we do know is that we want to keep the Trump tax cuts in place. If we can make them permanent, that would be ideal. Even if we have to extend them for 5 years, I would support that. But either way, it's really critical to keep the tax rates where they're at. This would affect, if they would go up, it would really affect small businesses across the country. And I know that's one of their top priorities.
Congressman, thanks for joining us as always. Marlin Stutzman, Republican from Indiana, with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Want to keep tabs on the markets before we assemble our panel. Charlie Pellet joins with the latest on Wall Street from world headquarters in New York, just hours away from the announcement on tariffs. Charlie, how's it look?
Right now we are higher across the board, not just higher, Joe Mathieu, but indeed very close to session highs on the S&P. Right now looking at a gain of 51 points. We're up by about 0.9%. The S&P at 5683. The Dow up 316. That is a gain of 0.7%. Tech stocks, though, outperforming. NASDAQ up 1.3% right now. The NASDAQ 100 index up 1.2%. The 10-year at 4.21%. The 2-year 3.92%. Gold up $13 the ounce, now at $31.26. That is a gain of 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.7%. 71.67 a barrel. Bitcoin up $1,700 now, up 2%, 86,936 on Bitcoin. The conservative media outlet Newsmax shares cut in half right now after a raucous two-day surge, fueled in part by retail traders that briefly made it larger than Fox Corp. Newsmax shares down today, right now, by 56.2%. And a federal judge has dismissed corruption charges against New York Mayor Eric Adams, bringing a permanent end to the case. Again, ahead of the big tariff announcement, S&P 500 index up 0.9%. Balance of Power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Just over 3.5 hours to go. And no news, 2.5 hours.
Yes.
Math can be difficult sometimes. 2.5 hours to go. We still have not heard from the White House any kind of preview as to what exactly it is the president will be announcing at 4 p.m. Eastern time. But we have heard from the White House, at least via the press secretary, that something that was reported in Politico earlier is apparently, and this is quoting Caroline Leavitt here, garbage. It was a report that the president has told members of his inner circle, including members of his cabinet, that Elon Musk will be leaving his forward-facing role as a special government employee at the Department of Government Efficiency, or working with it fairly soon. Now, whether or not the accuracy of the story is in question here. This is Politico reporting. We can't speak to that, Joe. But it is interesting that the timing of it coincides with what was a loss for Elon Musk yesterday after an investment not just of his own financial capital to the tune of $20 million, but also a good amount of his political capital went in to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race. He was backing the conservative candidate who ultimately lost by 10 points to the liberal candidate, Susan Crawford.
Today, Wisconsinites fended off an unprecedented attack on our democracy, and Wisconsins stood up and said loudly that justice does not have a price. Our courts are not for sale.
That's where we start with our political panel today. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, joined today by Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, Bluestack Strategies. Great to see you both and welcome. Jeannie, what does this mean for Democrats? Are people going a little far here? We're hearing this was the first good day for Democrats since the election of Donald Trump, and that may not be saying a lot, to be perfectly honest, as we look back over the past couple of months here. But these couple of statewide races, Wisconsin Supreme Court and the couple of seats that we saw actually stay Republican in Florida, mean what for Democrats?
Yeah, there is always a tendency to overread, but Joe, we have to give Democrats something. They've had a crappy few months, so they're out celebrating. And of course, Cory Booker last night, over 24 hours, helped buoy their spirits. So yeah, this was a big win in Wisconsin. It was also a necessary win. If Democrats had lost Wisconsin, that would have been catastrophic for them. Likewise, and I think Maura would agree, had Republicans lost those Florida seats, that would have been catastrophic for the GOP. So in some ways, this sort of reinforced the status quo. But there was something about the Florida wins. They were able to get those margins a little bit smaller than they were in 24, or a lot smaller. And they also carried Escambia County, and that was a big upset for the GOP. So there were some bright spots there for Democrats. But of course, they have to be careful about overreading, because we've been down this road before.
Well, and Maura, to Jeannie's points on the margins in Florida, I see there's kind of two ways of looking at it. One being that in both districts, Republicans won by double digits. The other being that those double-digit margins were half or less of what Republicans, including Donald Trump, were able to secure in those very same districts in November. Which side do you take on that?
Well, I think you could take the fact that people just didn't go out for this vote. I mean, it's 3 months after the Republican government took over, and we don't always see a large turnout when it comes to these off elections. And so I think with the economy not being great, people just didn't feel compelled to show up. It doesn't mean they went out and voted for the Democrat. It just means they didn't show up as strongly as they have in the past for elections, like for Donald Trump or for Mike Waltz, or, you know, it was held by Cliff Stearns for years, and he would have somewhere up to 70+% of the vote back when he was the member. So this is a very stronghold Republican district. That wasn't a surprise. I agree with Jeannie's point about Democrats looking for victory somewhere, you know, looking to take some bright spots here because they've had pretty bad days leading up until now. So they're looking at this as, okay, we have something to grasp onto and hopefully can use this towards, the elections in November with Virginia and New Jersey.
The money trail is pretty impressive, though, when you look at the way Democrats used money in all three races, Jeannie, outraising the Republican 3-1 in Florida's first district, outraising the Republican 10-1 in Florida's sixth, and Wisconsin nearly 2-1, making it the most expensive judicial battle in U.S. history. How much of all of this was just about money?
Yeah, and what's insane about that is that you see there the people who raised the most money also lost. And so it says what we know about American politics. And Donald Trump has said this over and over. Money is important, but it doesn't guarantee you a victory, as I'm sure Elon Musk would attest to today. And likewise, the Democrats who raised big money in Florida. And of course, we didn't expect them to win. But one thing I think Democrats have to be very cautious about, and you just mentioned before the setup, the Politico piece, Democrats have to be cautious about running against Elon Musk, because as Politico notes, Donald Trump could exit him off stage. And then what do Democrats run against in the midterm election? They have to keep their eye on the person in charge. This is Donald Trump's government. This is the GOP's government. It is not Elon Musk's. He's working at the behest of the president. And so Democrats have to focus like a laser beam on Donald Trump. And this announcement today at 4 o'clock is a big part of what they need to focus on, the economy.
Well, what about the way Republicans should be viewing Elon Musk now, Maura? Because we have seen evidence in the last several months of Republicans deciding to vote a different way, potentially change their behavior due to the threat of primary challenges being funded by Elon Musk. Is Wisconsin yesterday a lesson that even if Elon Musk throws his money at something, it's not necessarily something that you actually have to worry about? Or does his massive financial war chest, the largest, of course, of anyone in terms of wealth in the world, still mean you have to keep him on side?
I do think you're seeing that, especially in the Senate. They have a little more wiggle room, right? They have 6-year terms. And we saw, Rand Paul is standing with Tim Kaine on this, bill against tariffs for Canada. A couple others have joined them, and they're not as threatened by Elon Musk's threat, his I'm going to be involved in all the primaries. With the Doge thing and him leaving the White House, it was set when Doge was established and when it was announced that back when it was he and Vivek Ramaswamy, it was going to be dissolved on July 4th, 2026, America's 250th birthday. So it was already set, kind of in stone that this would be dissolved by then. And that's ahead of the midterm elections. And so to Jeannie's point, the Democrats do need a new strategy. It can't be just targeting or just standing anti-Trump or anti-Elon. And I think what Republicans will do is continue to focus on the people. And those are who they're going to be hearing from when these tariffs come into place, because they're going to have to see whether their constituents are willing to play the long game and trust in Donald Trump's plan, because the short-term pains, especially on farmers and especially on those who are already hurting to afford groceries, how long can they hold on for, and how long can those members keep their seats is to be said.
It's kind of interesting, Jeannie and Maura. We really haven't seen Elon Musk since Wisconsin, have we? Since he donned the cheese head and gave out the $1 million checks. Would it be smart, Maura, for Donald Trump to not have Elon Musk standing next to him in the Rose Garden today?
It would be smart for him for Elon to maybe take a step back and to focus on the task at hand, which was supposed to be giving out guidance and assessing where our fraud, waste, and abuse is. I think that the excessive role he has played thus far isn't necessarily a net benefit to Republicans, and I'm sure the president and the White House have been hearing as much. So, again, Donald Trump talks about how Elon has this big job and he's doing this out of his own goodwill. Well, then, it does cause you to wonder, should he go back to that big job that he has and let those who are elected do the job that the people who elected them to do, ask them to do. So that's where I think his focus needs to be, is on what the people who voted for him asked him to do in terms of the economy and safety and security.
Well, when we consider what they asked of the economy, obviously, Jeannie, it was in part that they wanted to see prices come down. Most economists would argue the tariffs he is going to announce today, at the very least, threaten to bring those prices up. Even if it's not Elon Musk standing beside him, does Donald Trump need to kind of allow the blame for tariffs should things not work out in the opportune fashion the administration is hoping it will, be cast elsewhere, not just as him as president alone?
Yeah, absolutely. But, who else is there to blame? We are already hearing that Howard Lutnick may take some blame if this doesn't all work out the way Donald Trump intends. The reality is Donald Trump owns this start to finish, and Democrats have to focus on him. He is the one who put Elon Musk in charge of Doge. He is the one who put Howard Lutnick in commerce and all of these folks. And he is the one who's deeply committed, apparently, to tariffs. And the reality is his eye is off the ball. What people elected him to do was to bring prices down and grow their incomes. All of this craziness about tariffs on and off and on and off that have undermined the market, reduced confidence of businesses and consumers, isn't helping him. And he is doing what presidential candidates and then new presidents often do, overread their election victory. He's got to focus on what people brought him there to do. And we'll see today whether he does that or not. By the way, Kailey, I forgot to say happy Liberation Day.
Oh, wow. That was nice.
And Joe, too,
Yeah,
not just
Jeannie.
Kailey.
Well, I appreciate
sorry,
that very
Joe.
much.
And Maura as well.
Yeah, no, all the way around, I feel
And
like.
Maura.
Thank you, Jeannie. That's very kind.
Jeannie Shanzano, Maura Gillespie, our political panel on this Liberation Day. At least that's what President Trump is calling it. Thank you both so much for joining us. But the question, of course, we have is just how liberating people will find this announcement to be. It probably depends in large part what the announcement actually is. And at the risk of beating a dead horse, as of 1:34 p.m., we still don't know.
I've heard a couple of different ones. I've heard Libation Day. I heard Doug Ford call it Termination Day. He's going to be talking with us on the late edition of Balance of Power.
Indeed, that's coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern Time as part of our special extended coverage, but we have more ahead here on Bloomberg TV and Radio First.
Donald Trump not only talking tariffs today, though, at the White House, Kailey, he's talking TikTok. Charlie Pellet just put his finger on it.
Yep.
By the way, this is before we got the breaker, the headline about Amazon, which Bloomberg is now reporting. There was a meeting to consider a proposal for taking over TikTok by Oracle, Blackstone, and a couple of other investors. This just got more complicated because now Amazon apparently is going to drop a bid.
Yeah, although the president has been saying there were multiple bidders interested in TikTok, but we have a lot of lingering questions. One being which bid is seen as most attractive at this point. The other being, will that include the algorithm or will that actually be left to Chinese control? Of course, that was one of the main concerns of the bipartisan legislation that passed that would see TikTok banned or divested to begin with.
Yes, if you're not buying the algorithm, though, are you really buying TikTok?
Well, maybe we should ask this question to Mike Shepard, who, of course, leads our coverage of technology and strategic industries here at Bloomberg. So obviously, Mike, there seem to be a number of players in the game. Our reporting indicates that Amazon's bid is not being taken that seriously. Why would it be? And if it's not Amazon's, who is?
Well, it's a great question. And we're hoping to get a little bit more clarity from this out of the White House this afternoon. You know, it's a full court press trying to figure out what is going on. But Amazon has a reputation for kicking tires on different companies and weighing a bid and then pulling away. And it did come a little bit later in the game compared to, say, some of the others that we've seen. Even Mr. Beast has thrown his hat in the ring with and then we also have Frank McCourt, who was interviewed by our colleague Caroline Hyde earlier today on Bloomberg Television, talking about his bid from Project Liberty. And they, interestingly, don't intend to buy TikTok with the algorithm. They are content to leave it in Chinese hands and then try to construct it on their own. And he says they have a way to do that. They have a price that they're willing to pay for TikTok without the algorithm. But I think you raised a good question. Why would you want this app without this influential recommendation feature that's powered it so effectively?
It's like kind of like buying Coke without the recipe, right?
That's a great way to put it, Joe, because it is sort of that secret sauce that makes it work so effectively. And yet maybe in this era of AI, there is a way to re-engineer it and perhaps do it a little bit more quickly and cost effectively too.
But would that be in keeping with the actual law, or does that matter if it's ultimately the Trump administration that is the enforcement mechanism for that law?
Well, you know, this is one of the, it's a conundrum. There are so many layers to this story of TikTok. And a year ago at this time, we were talking about the push to see this divestiture ban legislation get through Congress. Ultimately, it did. It was attached, you'll both remember well, to the Ukraine and Israel aid package. And that kind of sped it through, and people hailed its passage, and Joe Biden signed it. And then as the time passed, and they had to actually find not only a buyer, but get ByteDance and the Chinese government to go along, that's where it became more difficult because ByteDance has no interest in selling this valuable asset. And the Chinese government likewise doesn't either. And they would need to sign off on any divestiture involving the algorithm because it is such sensitive technology.
Thanks for popping in on this. An important development here on the way to the deadline. Mike Shepard, of course, with us in Washington. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz on this Tariff Day, I think we can call it. Yeah, they say Liberation Day at the White House, but of course, that's up for interpretation. We know Mark Zandi isn't thinking of it that way. The chief economist at Moody's Analytics joins us right now. Mark, it's great to have you as we count down to the announcement. I was taken by your statement earlier in the week here that if we do get the across-the-board tariffs, and want to be very clear. We don't know what the president will announce today in terms of reciprocals. Maybe there will be something across the board. But your worst case scenario includes an immediate recession, an unemployment rate above 7%. What would that look like today?
Yeah, well, Joe, that is the worst case scenario. That would be a 20% effective tariff. So that would put the tariff rate back to where we were Smoot-Hawley 1930s depression. So that's pretty extreme. I also, in that scenario, assume full retaliation. So China and everyone else retaliates in kind. So that's kind of a bookend. But if we got it, that would be a very severe downturn. Unemployment would go from 4 currently to 7+ over the next year and a half. So it'd be pretty serious. So I don't expect that, but that kind of gives you a sense of magnitude. I mean, my sense, Joe, and obviously this can go in lots of different directions in a couple hours, but my sense is that the president's going to try to figure out a way to give himself an exit strategy, just in case things go off the rails. So something to the effect that, well, we're going to raise tariffs, but if other countries lower theirs, we'll lower ours as well, and that will give him a way to pivot and move on. And that's why in my baseline worldview, the kind of what I think actually is going to happen here, I don't have a recession, because I think he's going to figure out a way to pivot, declare victory, and move on. He's pretty good at that.
Well, so would that then, if it is an imposition of tariffs, but then they are either reduced or taken away entirely in relatively short order, Mark, that would feed into the transitory narrative, right? You may see a price adjustment, but they could easily adjust back, or at the very least wouldn't keep climbing. Yeah, no, that's right. I'll take that. Give me that scenario. I mean, what we've been through here is not good. We came into the year with a really solid, well-growing economy, and the economy is now struggling. But there's still the economy is still in a good fundamental place. I think if we pivot here on economic policy, particularly the trade policy here quickly, the economy will regain its footing, and we should be fine. And by the way, that may be what the stock market's signaling here. Stock investors are kind of thinking along the same lines, that the president will figure a way out of this without actually raising those tariffs to 20%.
So if we kind of play this out a little bit more, and we see tariffs from other countries come down, if the president succeeds in zeroing out, so to speak, our trade relationship with some of our more important partners, does this end up being a win? Are we talking about new levels of growth, a market that springs back to attention in that world?
Well, a win? When the president took office, the effective tariff rate was, 2.5% to 3%? A win would be getting back down to 2.5% to 3% and lower than that.
Okay.
I suspect that's not in the cards. So, but maybe we avert 20%. Maybe we get them back down to 3, 4, or 5, something like that. I'd take it, but I don't know that I go so far as to declare a win. I'm sure the president's going to declare it a win, but from my vantage point, I'm not sure I'd think of that as a victory.
Well, something else he says is a win are investments that have already been announced into the United States in terms of manufacturing capacity. He anticipates that more of that will be happening, as you won't face a tariff if you make it in the United States. But Mark, how long exactly will it take for that extra productive capacity to be realized, to build these factories, to get the appropriate workers, to actually have the output ready and available and supplying the market?
Come on, Kailey, come on. Think about this for 3 seconds. Okay, you're a CEO of a global manufacturing firm, and you're trying to decide, should I invest in the United States? Next question you're going to ask is, well, what are the tariffs? And what are they going to be tomorrow? And what are they going to be a year from now? And because it takes, say, I'm a vehicle manufacturer, it takes 3 years to put up a vehicle manufacturing plant. What are they going to be in 3 years? And, oh, by the way, I want that plant to be around for, 2, 3 decades? What are the tariffs going to be 2, 3 decades from now? These tariffs, even if we got crystal clear clarity on the tariffs today, this is exactly what they are, and I'm telling you they're going to stay there. Does anyone believe that? I mean, these are done under executive order. It's not written in legislation. This can be wiped out with the stroke of a pen, and likely would be. So I just don't see that argument. I don't get it. And there have been announcements, of manufacturers saying, "Oh, I'm going to invest in the country," but how do we know they wouldn't happen anyway? And how do we know they're actually going to follow through? Do you remember Foxconn? Go back to the President Trump's first term. Foxconn was this round number, $10 billion. That sounds familiar. Hyundai is also $10 billion. $10 billion investment. Go take a look at what's actually invested, right? Right now. So, I don't get it. I just don't see how tariffs done under executive order, and maybe they're not even legal. Are they legal? I'm not sure. Are they? I mean, I'm sure they're going to be tested in the court system, and maybe we figure this out 3 years later. But again, I'm the CEO trying to figure out whether this investment I'm going to make makes any sense 3 years from now. Does it make any sense?
So if you're that CEO, you're making cars on both sides of the border here, some in Michigan, some in Canada. Mark Zandi, you just grin and bear it knowing these things go away in a couple of years, as opposed to moving your manufacturing back to the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would do is I'd figure out, different trading patterns, different supply chains. Who am I going to sell to? I mean, the U.S. is not a reliable partner. I'm going to sell into it because it's a big market. I'm going to do my best, but I'm going to look for other markets and other ways of doing business. So, but to actually make a big investment based on those tariffs, I don't know how you do that. I just don't see it.
Well, and I wonder, Mark, how you're viewing this notion that these tariffs are not being imposed in a vacuum, that they're coming in tandem with an effort to reduce the size of the federal government and cut federal spending, also with the aim of cutting taxes at some point before the end of the year, keeping in mind that during the first trade war in the first Trump administration, there was a subsidization effort for farmers specifically who were caught up in the retaliatory fire. Do you think that kind of subsidizing or stimulating to try to offset the effects is likely to happen this time around, given those new dynamics at play?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, one of the interesting kind of conversations recently is, suppose you put in these high tariffs, say it's 15%, 20%, if you kind of do the simple arithmetic, you take the 15, 20%, you multiply by the amount of imported product that is tariffed, and you get a revenue number. You say, oh, look at all the revenue I'm creating. But that abstracts from the fact that when you raise price, demand falls. So if I'm going to raise the price of a vehicle, I'm going to sell less vehicles. So imports are going to decline, trade volumes are going to decline. It also ignores the fact that if you had those kind of actually impose those kinds of tariffs, you would get retaliation and you would get a recession. And if you got a recession, what would that do to tax revenue and to government spending? And then on top of that, to your point, there's going to be aggrieved parties. In President Trump's first term, it was the farmers. They got crushed by China saying, I'm not buying your stuff. And they're doing that again already. And the farmers are struggling again already. And they say, please help bail me out. Effectively, give me a check to compensate for that. And that's a cost. So you add this all, up. You say, well, what, at the end of the day, how much revenue am I actually going to generate? And by the way, I don't think the tariffs get beyond a year if you actually were 15 or 20% and you go into recession. So you can't count on those revenues going forward. So you can't say, oh, over the next 10 years, I'm going to generate X, because these tariffs aren't going to be there over the next 10 years. So that whole argument, I'm going to raise a lot of revenue, I find very specious.
Mark, I've only got a minute. Word is we're not going to see paper until after the president speaks. So in our remaining moment, what's the most important thing you're going to be waiting to hear from Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, I'm listening to that top line number, and then I'm going to look for an exit strategy, because if things don't go as planned, how do I get out of this in a reasonably graceful way? And so I'll be looking for that. If there's no exit strategy, then I get more concerned, but if there's some, I lower tariffs and if you lower tariffs, I lower tariffs, and you have that kind of mechanism built in, then I feel more comfortable with that. And I say, okay, this is going to play out like my baseline. We're not going into recession.
All right. Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics here with us on Balance of Power in anticipation of that announcement just over 2 hours from now. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we will hopefully have more information in hand by the next time you see us and hear us on Bloomberg TV and radio by 5 p.m. Eastern time.
That's entirely likely. Mark Zandi, looking for the off-ramps. We're just looking for the details on tariffs, and we're going to have them for you. So stay with us here. Bloomberg Business Week on the way. The close, followed by an extended edition of Balance of Power. We'll meet you back here, 5 p.m. Eastern time on Bloomberg TV and radio. In the meantime, subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Get yourself set up. Go to Apple, Spotify, wherever you do your podcasts, and subscribe. You'll be the smartest in the room by 4 o'clock. Listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.